Hello everyone and welcome to my channel YNR Trends. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. The night Genoa City stopped breathing began with rain slashing the streets like a punishment, the kind that soaked secrets out of the pavement and carried them screaming toward the truth. And in that chaos Sharon never saw Allie coming until the world went black around the edges and the taste of fear flooded her mouth. Because one moment she was unlocking her door with 1,000 thoughts spinning through her head about Noah, about Sienna, about the nagging sense that something was wrong, and the next there was a sharp sting at her neck, the blur of headlights smearing into darkness, and then cold metal, cold air, cold certainty that this was no accident, that this was personal. When Sharon woke, her wrists burned from rope, her head throbbed, and the room smelled like mildew and old wood, a forgotten place that felt like it had been waiting for her. And across from her stood Allie, eyes glassy, hands shaking, a gun resting on the table between them like a judge waiting to pass sentence. And before Sharon could even speak, Allie laughed, a broken, hysterical sound that echoed off the walls and made Sharon's blood run colder than the concrete beneath her feet, because this wasn't rage. It was grief sharpened into something deadly. Allie paced like a trapped animal, ranting about lies and blood and family and how Sharon had always been at the center of everything in Genoa City, always surviving while others paid the price. And Sharon, still dizzy, tried to reason with her. Tried to say Allie didn't have to do this, but the words died the moment Allie slammed her palm on the table and screamed the truth she had been carrying like a loaded weapon, the truth that detonated the room. Noah and Sienna killed her. Allie hissed, tears streaking down her face as she leaned forward, close enough that Sharon could smell the salt and terror on her skin. They killed her and you helped bury it. Sharon felt the air leave her lungs as if she'd been punched, denial leaping to her lips out of instinct, but Allie cut her off with brutal precision, recounting every detail like a confession she'd memorized in the dark, how that night had spiraled out of control, how jealousy and fear turned into shouting, how a shove became a fall, how the sound of bone cracking against stone still echoed in Sienna's screams, how Noah panicked, how blood pooled too fast, how Sienna, sweet, complicated, desperate Sienna, made a choice that could never be undone, and how afterward they stood there shaking, staring at a body that refused to move while the world kept spinning cruelly on. Sharon's face drained of color as fragments she had ignored, inconsistencies she had excused, moments she had chosen not to examine too closely slammed together into a horrifying picture. And Allie saw it, the recognition, and that was when she snapped, shouting that Sharon had known, that a mother always knows, that Sharon had chosen to protect her son instead of the dead girl whose name no one said anymore. And Sharon's voice finally broke as she whispered Noah's name like a prayer, like a curse, like an apology to a ghost who couldn't hear her. The rain thundered harder outside as Allie dragged Sharon to her feet, forcing her toward a flickering light bulb that cast long, distorted shadows on the walls, shadows that looked like hands reaching out from the past. And Allie demanded Sharon confess, demanded she admit that she'd helped clean the blood, helped spin the story, helped silence the truth, because Allie needed it said out loud, needed the universe to acknowledge the crime that had stolen her sanity and her sleep. And Sharon, shaking, finally did what she'd been avoiding since the moment she realized something terrible had happened. She told the truth, admitting that Noah had come to her that night, eyes wild, clothes stained, begging her to help him fix the unfixable, admitting that fear had overridden morality, that she had convinced herself she was saving her child, that she never imagined the weight would become this unbearable. And with every word Allie seemed to crumble and harden at the same time, grief twisting into something sharp and righteous, something that demanded consequences. She screamed that Sharon didn't get to be forgiven, that Noah didn't get to walk free, that Sienna didn't get to rewrite history as a victim when she had blood on her hands too. And Sharon sobbed, collapsing to the floor, realizing that the lie she'd wrapped around her family like armor had instead become a cage, trapping all of them in a nightmare with no clean escape. Outside, sirens wailed somewhere far away, oblivious to the reckoning unfolding in that forgotten room, as Allie raised the gun with trembling resolve and told Sharon this kidnapping wasn't about revenge, it was about truth, about forcing the world to finally look at Noah and Sienna not as tragic figures or misunderstood souls but as killers. And Sharon, through tears, begged Allie to stop, begged her not to destroy more lives, begged her to let Sharon go to the police herself, to do the right thing now. But Allie just laughed again, hollow and broken, saying it was far too late for the right thing, that the only thing left was exposure. And as she stepped back into the shadows, locking the door behind her, leaving Sharon bound and screaming her son's name into the darkness, the truth finally escaped its grave, rising like a storm that would rip through Genoa City, tearing apart families, shattering loyalties, and ensuring that nothing, no love, no lie, no legacy would ever be the same again. The hours after Allie vanished stretched into an endless, suffocating blur for Sharon, each second crawling across her skin like an accusation, the ropes cutting deeper as circulation faltered and her mind replayed Noah's face from that terrible night again and again, his hands shaking, his voice breaking, the way she had told herself that mothers were meant to protect even when protection felt like sin, and now that choice sat with her in the dark like a second captor, whispering that this was the price because somewhere beyond those damp walls Allie was moving like a force of nature, her grief ignited into purpose, her phone lighting up as she sent messages, anonymous tips, fragments of truth sharpened into weapons, setting dominoes in motion across Genoa City. Nick was the first to feel the tremor when a text arrived with a single line. Ask Sharon what really happened the night she lied for Noah, and his heart dropped as instincts screamed that something was terribly wrong while, at the same time Noah paced his apartment, hands buried in his hair, the walls closing in as notifications exploded online, rumors mutating into headlines, whispers of a dead girl's name suddenly spoken aloud after months of silence, and Sienna, pale and frantic, watched the news feed with widening eyes, recognizing details only someone who had been there could know, details she had sworn would never see daylight. Back in the basement Sharon fought the ropes until her wrists bled, screaming into the void until her voice cracked, begging anyone to hear her, and when exhaustion finally dragged her into a half-conscious haze she dreamed of the girl's face, the one she had avoided picturing for so long, eyes open and accusing, asking why Sharon had chosen blood over truth, and she woke sobbing as the door finally creaked open, flooding the room with harsh light and revealing Allie again, transformed now, calmer, colder, like someone who had crossed the line and found clarity on the other side. Allie knelt in front of Sharon, her voice eerily steady as she told her the city was already buzzing, that names were being said out loud, that Noah's alibi was unraveling thread by thread, and Sharon's chest tightened with a terror deeper than fear for herself, because she knew what this would do to her son, knew how fragile Noah already was, knew that the truth didn't just expose, it destroyed, and she begged Allie to stop, offering herself instead. Offering confession, prison, public humiliation, anything if Allie would leave Noah out of it, but Allie's expression hardened as she reminded Sharon that Noah hadn't left the dead girl out of anything, that mercy had already been spent. Across town Nick burst into Noah's apartment, demanding answers as sirens wailed faintly in the distance, and when Noah denied everything too quickly, too desperately, Nick saw it, the same look Sharon had worn for years, the look of someone drowning in a secret, and the room imploded as Nick roared the truth out of him, while Noah collapsed onto the floor sobbing, admitting that it was an accident, that he never meant for anyone to die, that Sienna had only tried to help, and Nick's world shattered as he realized the rot had been growing right under his nose. Meanwhile Sienna fled, suitcase half-packed, paranoia clawing at her throat as memories resurfaced with brutal clarity, the push, the scream, the sickening thud, and every step she took away from Genoa City felt heavier. Like the dead were gripping her ankles, refusing to let her run. Back in captivity Sharon finally snapped, rage and grief colliding as she screamed at Allie that she had already lost everything, that this truth wouldn't bring anyone back, that it would only create more bodies in its wake, and Allie screamed back that justice was never clean, that silence was worse, that she had lived with the weight of knowing while everyone else smiled and moved on, and now it was Sharon's turn to choke on it. As dawn crept closer the city erupted, police knocking on doors, reporters circling like vultures, Noah taken in for questioning as cameras flashed and his name splashed across screens. Sharon Newman's son linked to death. And Sharon, hearing the distant sirens from her concrete tomb, felt something inside her finally break, a maternal instinct twisting into despair as she realized she could no longer protect him, that the lie had outgrown her. Allie watched the chaos unfold on her phone, tears silently sliding down her cheeks as she whispered apologies to the ghost who had driven her here. And in a moment of twisted mercy she cut Sharon's ropes, not to free her, but to force her to walk out into the storm she had helped create, promising that Sharon would face the world and answer for everything, because this story was no longer hers to control. As Sharon stumbled into the gray morning light, wrists raw, soul exposed, Genoa City held its breath, unaware that the worst was still coming because Noah's confession was incomplete. Sienna's escape would ignite a manhunt, And buried beneath all of it was one final truth neither mother nor avenger was ready to face. The death had not been as accidental as anyone wanted to believe, and when that secret surfaced, it would turn tragedy into something far more monstrous, dragging them all past the point of no return. The truth detonated at noon, when the fragile narrative of accident finally collapsed under the weight of evidence and conscience, and Genoa City watched in collective horror as what had once been whispered as tragedy hardened into something darker. Because while Noah sat in a stark interrogation room replaying the same broken confession, hands cuffed, eyes red, Sienna's flight unraveled in real time. Her car abandoned near the river with blood on the door handle that wasn't there before, blood that didn't match the girl who died, blood that pointed to a second struggle no one had ever admitted. And as detectives followed the trail backward, it led not to panic but to planning, to text messages deleted but not erased, to a recording buried deep in a cloud account that captured Sienna's voice shaking but resolute as she said the words that would shatter every defense. If she tells anyone, we're done, Noah, everything is over. And suddenly the city understood that fear hadn't ruled that night, control had. Sharon learned this truth the hardest way, standing in the police station hallway as the walls closed in and the sound of her son's name echoed from every direction. When a detective approached with eyes full of something between pity and judgment and told her they'd uncovered proof of a second confrontation, proof that the victim had tried to leave, that she had threatened to expose an affair, a scheme, a lie that would have destroyed Sienna's carefully constructed life. And Sharon's knees buckled as she realized that the moment she'd buried had not been an accident to be forgiven but a choice to be judged. A moment where her son had frozen and Sienna had acted, and Sharon's protection had sealed it. Outside, Allie watched from the crowd as Sharon crumpled, the vindication she thought would feel like relief instead slicing her open with guilt, because this wasn't justice glowing with righteousness, it was devastation radiating outward, hurting everyone it touched, and yet she couldn't turn away. Couldn't stop now that the truth was alive and clawing its way free. Noah, confronted with the recording, finally broke in a way that left no room for denial, admitting that he had known Sienna meant to silence her, that he had begged her to stop, that when the push came he hadn't pushed but he hadn't pulled back either, that he had stood there paralyzed while Sienna made a decision that could never be undone. And the room went quiet as the weight of complicity settled like a verdict, because sometimes guilt wasn't about the blow you struck but the one you allowed. Sienna, found hours later hiding in a derelict motel, eyes hollow, hands stained with blood from a cut she hadn't bothered to bandage, laughed when they arrested her. A sound so empty it chilled even the officers, and as cameras captured her being led away she locked eyes with Sharon through the crowd and mouthed the words that would haunt her forever. You chose him. And Sharon understood that this was the final cost of that choice, that the lie she told herself had raised a monster and fed it. The fallout hit like an earthquake, families splintering, loyalties burning to ash, Nick turning away from Sharon in a silence heavier than rage, the city debating not just guilt but morality, mothers everywhere whispering the same terrified question, what would I do? And Allie standing alone on the bridge at sunset, clutching the locket she'd carried since the funeral that never happened, whispering to the water that she was sorry, that she hadn't wanted blood, only truth. As sirens faded and the city settled into a stunned quiet, by nightfall charges were filed, headlines screamed, and the story that began with a kidnapping ended with a reckoning that would ripple for years, because Noah would face prison not just for what he did but for what he allowed, Sienna would face the cold clarity of consequence, and Sharon would face something far worse than bars or judgment, the knowledge that love without accountability had destroyed everything she tried to save. And as Genoa City exhaled in grief and fury, one truth remained undeniable and irreversible. The past, once buried, never stays dead, and when it rises it demands payment from everyone who helped put it in the ground. The final reckoning arrived not with sirens or screams, but with a silence so heavy it pressed against every heart in Genoa City, because by the time the courtroom doors closed and the cameras were shut out, there was nothing left to hide, nothing left to argue, only the raw, irreversible truth sitting between them like a body no one could step around. Sharon sat rigid on the wooden bench, hands folded so tightly her knuckles burned, watching Noah stand as the judge read the findings in a voice stripped of drama, a voice that made it all worse because it treated the devastation as fact, as history already written. And when the words complicit in the death echoed through the chamber, Sharon felt something inside her finally tear free, not as a scream but as a quiet collapse, the kind that leaves nothing standing afterward. Noah did not cry, did not beg, did not look back at his mother, Because in that moment he understood that the greatest mercy she had given him, her silence, had also been his greatest curse, teaching him that love could erase consequence. And as he was led away he whispered, "I'm sorry," into the hollow space between them. An apology meant for everyone and no one. An apology that could never be enough. Sienna's sentence followed, colder, sharper, stripped of ambiguity, and when the judge spoke her name there was no confusion left in the room about who she was or what she had done, because intent had been proven, choice had been established, and the finality of it all settled over her like a shroud. She smiled once, brittle and defiant, before the reality broke through and her face crumpled, not in regret for the life she took but in terror for the one she was about to lose. And Sharon could not look away, because this was the face of the nightmare she had helped protect. The cost of mistaking fear for innocence. Outside the courthouse, Allie stood alone as the verdicts were read aloud, the city buzzing around her but strangely distant, because the justice she had burned everything to achieve did not feel like victory, only closure edged with grief. She closed her eyes and imagined the girl who died finally at rest, her name spoken, her story known, no longer a shadow erased by convenience, and for the first time since that night, Allie allowed herself to breathe, even as tears fell, even as she accepted that truth never gives back what it takes. Sharon's punishment did not come from the law, but from the aftermath, from the empty house where Noah's footsteps would never echo again, from the way Nick could no longer meet her eyes, from the whispers that followed her through town not with cruelty but with a devastating kind of understanding. People didn't hate her, they recognized her, and that recognition was unbearable, because it forced her to face the part of herself she had denied, the mother who had crossed a line she could never uncross. In the end, Genoa City moved on the way it always did, with new scandals, new betrayals, new tragedies waiting to be born, but this one left a scar that refused to fade. A reminder carved into its collective memory that love without truth is not protection, that silence can be as violent as any act, and that the dead do not stay buried simply because the living are afraid to dig. As Sharon stood at her window that final night, staring out at a city forever changed, she whispered her son's name into the dark, not as a plea, not as an excuse but as an acceptance, and in that quiet surrender, the story finally ended, not with redemption, but with accountability, the only ending it had ever been heading toward.